Karl Marx and Civilization. I reviewed again and again the past and current Marxist writings in both Spanish and English. I saw with amazement that I did not identify with any interpretation or with any subject. For a while I identified with the subject of Marx and ecology. I managed to make a short but conclusive article with Karl Marx, but despite this, the conclusion today I realize, she was wrong. I began by synthesizing my readings with topics such as civil society, taxes, and some other topics from the writings of Marx and Engels. I did it for my own understanding, not that I distrusted Chinese manuals or Russians, but that I felt that the way of exposing in dictionaries and books were the same explanation, or rather in the same framework of definition. The vast majority of Marxist studies are by professors from the Third World or the First World, but with affinities or sympathies towards the population of less civilized regions. A good example is the Englishman Eric Hobsbawm, who even wrote the book Viva la Revolución, sobre America Latina. That is, Marxist authors have a view totally contrary to Marx himself, as we will see as he expounds. We will put as a warning that we will not use sophisticated Marxist systems to expose simple things. What Marx has written is simple in nature, but Marxists have made everything complex to in most cases expose the opposite of the subject. The classic example is that of alienation or alienation, not only complicating the issue, but yielding contrary results, and most importantly diverting the main theme from what Marx said: production and capital. The work of Karl Marx's Capital is an unfinished work to which he dedicated 20 years of his life. Its objective is to show, dialectically expose how capitalism works and its immanent laws. In this important and central work in the modern world we see definitions of civilization that surprise us. Definition. Let's start with some early works like the Manifesto of the Communist Party and the Situation of the Working Class in England. We read in the manifesto that the bourgeoisie drags into the current of civilization all nations, even the most barbaric. The low prices of their goods constitute the heavy artillery that collapses all the walls of China and makes the barbarians most fanatically hostile to foreigners capitulate. It compels all nations, if they do not wish to succumb, to adopt the bourgeois mode of production, constrains them to introduce so-called civilization, that is, to become bourgeois. We visibly identify the terms bourgeoisie and civilization but as synonyms, if as one generator of the other. Capitalism produces civilization. It drags the barbarians with its secret weapon that is the cheap merchandise and of superior quality to the old ones, and that supplies new needs. By 1848 Marx complained that society possesses too much civilization, too many livelihoods, too much industry, too much commerce. The objective of study is this wonder that has arisen from feudalism or pre-capitalism and creates wonders that produce commodities and services in an infinite way. That is why it studies advanced societies, especially the capitalist one, because they make possible a new world full of food, means of production and life. It should be remembered that the manifesto was written because a bourgeois revolution was coming in Europe, mainly in Germany. This meant that the capitalists were hindered by feudal remains in all spheres, in the economic, political, legislative, in religious beliefs, and so on. It is a call to participate in this revolution, so that it advances as much as possible this revolution and gets rid of the remnants of the old feudal mode of production, and that it follows, in its own way, the example of England, that is, to adopt and adapt the fabulous English Industrial Revolution. That is why it points out that this occurs in the countries where modern civilization has developed. 3. It must be remembered that the writings of Marx and Engels, especially those of Marx, are composed of 10% of complaints or contradictions or Jeremiad, let's call it petty bourgeois or Sismondiatus complaints, of Simon de Sismond, of whom he said that he was good at seeing the contradictions of the capitalist system, but nothing more, and 90% of positive things of the capitalist system, for example the contributions of Adam Smith, Ricardo, etc. Usually what Marxists expose is only the complaining Sismondian aspect of the petty bourgeoisie, of the Kleinberger Lenin said, that is, issues such as exploitation, alienation, exploitation, and alienation. Of that 10% I will not expose here plenty of literature and academics about it. In the preparatory notebooks Fundamental Elements for the Critique of Political Economy, the Grundrisse, which are political economic notes, Karl Marx points out several times in his exposition interesting notes in Synthesis on Civilization, which we remember has been nothing more than the capitalist system. He makes the following notes, hence the great civilizing influence of capital, for he mentions not only the civilizing influence of capital but almost as a synonym for civilization, an aspect that he develops again and again, that yet all Marxists intentionally hide or deny, both their own writings and those of Marx. In the simple concept of capital must be contained in itself its civilizing tendencies, etc., and not present itself as in the preceding economies, merely as consequences. 5. There is an enormous amount of articles where they talk about the crisis of the economy of capitalism, the ecological crisis, and a crazy series of topics related to the word crisis, this approximately from the 1970s until today, 2022, when what happens is an immense development of the productive forces of capital. Virtually everyone has at least one car, a washing machine, internet, cell phone, air conditioning in their home or on their property. From the notes in John Wade's book, History of the Middle and Working Classes, in Chapter 6 of Capital, the capitalist is the social man par excellence, he represents civilization. 6, elsewhere he transcribes capital is just another name for civilization. 7, if we follow the meaning expressed in the relationship between capital and civilization, it is easy to understand that Marx agrees with both expressions and perhaps wished to use it later for a later explanation. But denying that capital is a civilizational aspect is not saying it implicitly or explicitly. Taking further note, capital is a collective force, 8, implying that it is the great organizer of the creation of the social force. Not only is Marx marveling at capital, as well as at the process of producing commodities and services to which he confers immense transformative powers, as can be seen in the Communist Manifesto, but on the commodity transport system itself. Trade itself confers it as the so-called civilizing effect of foreign trade. 9, especially to foreign trade, since when it reaches other peoples and nations it incorporates them into civilization. The commodity exerts its constructive and destructive effect at the same time. Marx proposed to develop the following theme in the Grundrisse, civilization, with my observations on it. 10. I could say that we have gathered many of your comments on this. Our annotations are not so adequate, but it is the first time in the history of Marxism that this subject is developed, and most certainly 90 or 95% accurate with Marx in presenting the subject. All past expressions have been overlooked, but also this one where he speaks of the tendency, this tendency to propagation, or civilizing, is only proper to capital, unlike all previous conditions of production. 11. Usually Marxists only choose phrases like downward trend of the rate of profit, or crisis, exploitation, grab a topic or word and based on it make their thesis to get a position in the university. Usually they are hollow words of a petty bourgeois resentment frightened by capitalism, which he calls savage. True. Capitalism has created such productive forces, which has been able to grow the population to enormous levels, feed them, clothe them, provide them with instruction, education, internet, washing machine, electricity, cars, own house, almost 100% of the population. Competition may give rise to the need for railways, for example, in a country in which the development achieved until then by the productive forces would not have raised it. The effect of competition between nations corresponds to the section on international trade. The civilizing effects of capital are manifested here in a special way. 12. When it refers to civilizing effects, it does not mean that the civilizing population learn to read Shakespeare or to watch operas, but to be productive people or to be part of the production or supply chain of capital. While they nourish the spirit, the soul, an entire country that reads a lot and produces nothing, is a waste of resources and time. Marx calls it the civilizing tendency of capital. 13. Not only in the Grundrisse, but throughout all the writings of economics and politics Marx sees the civilizing tendency of capital. I have wondered several times why Marxist readers, especially Marxist professors, academics, evade this very important, if not the most significant of all, aspect. The answer is that the vast majority belong to uncivilized countries, whether barbarian, despotic or semi-civilized. I also looked among the most recognized Marxist authors of the First World, such as the United States, England, France, Germany, if they adopted Marx's view of the civilizing aspect of capital, as well as whether they agreed with the recommendations expressed by Marx in the prologue of Capital that the least developed countries should follow the more developed ones, that is, to follow England or countries that work like them, that is, those who follow the English mode of production. But none of the so-called intellectuals did such work, but on the contrary, not only do they not recognize the progressive, civilizing role of capital, but they only know how to denounce it, condemn it, and as for the aspect of following the model of the most civilized country as an example, England in its time and today to the United States, they do the opposite, they follow or support the most backward, savage, despotic, semi-civilized or even uncivilized countries, as in the case of Cambodia during Pol Pot. Before continuing, I will explain in a few words the reason why Marx wrote his book Capital in the words of the writer himself. In this case the lines belong to the same first prologue of that book, which expresses to know that what I have to investigate in this work is the capitalist mode of production and the relations of production and exchange corresponding to it. The classic seat of this mode of production is, to this day, England. This is why, in developing my theory, I use that country as the main source of examples. But if the German reader were to shrug his shoulders pharisaically at the situation of the English industrial or agricultural workers, or if he consoled himself with the optimistic idea that in Germany things are still far from having deteriorated so much, I would be forced to warn him, de te fabula narrator. History refers to you. 14. When he mentions Germany, he means that he must follow England as the main source of examples, of such good paradigms that Karl Marx endorses them for his own country, which was behind England. With more reason this must apply to countries that are in more backward or less developed stages as semi-civilized countries, despots, semi-savages, barbarians, or semi-barbarians. The following passage of the aforementioned tells us acutely what the study of society is about, of its laws, in itself, and for itself. It is not here the greater or lesser degree reached, in its development, by the social antagonisms that result from the natural laws of capitalist production. It is about these laws themselves, about those tendencies that operate and are imposed with iron need. The most industrially developed country does nothing but show at least develop the image of its own future. 15. Why should these laws themselves be studied, but to reproduce them in another space, in another time? What other motive can underlie studying more than 2,000 pages of Capital where these trends, those laws, are described? What reason underlies in studying a career in mechanical engineering more than that of applying what was learned in the field of mechanics? Absurd would be to spend about 20 years in school so that in the end, when reaching adulthood upon graduation, the citizen student, the new engineer spends it criticizing, trying to discredit the arts of mechanical engineering instead of doing, build or improve useful works, concrete for humanity. So childish and harmful are the theses of thousands of bachelor's, master's and doctoral degrees of Marxists whose theses or objectives are only to destroy capitalism and only propose nonsense as a replacement. This part of Capital has no loss, every word expresses the intention of the author who I have called the Testament of Karl Marx. Let us look at the following passage as Marx expresses himself openly about petty bourgeois, crafts and other obsolete modes of production. But let's put this aside. Where capitalist production has fully acclimatized among us, for example in the factories themselves, the conditions are much worse than in England, for the counterweight of the factory laws is lacking. In all other spheres we are tormented, as in the other Western countries of the European continent, not only by the development of capitalist production, but by the lack of that development. In addition to modern miseries, we are overwhelmed by a whole series of inherited miseries, resulting from the fact that they continue to vegetate old modes of production, mere survivals, with their cohort of anachronistic social and political relations. We suffer not only because of the living, but also because of the dead. Le mort saisit levif. The dead man catches the living. 16. That is, in a society less civilized than England, for example Germany or France, what is needed is more development of the capitalist system. There is a lack of more production in quantity and quality of commodities that can be equated with those of England or the United States. What is missing is that there are large capitals that can create large companies that can manufacture on a large scale with little added work, at a low price. That is why he says that we are tormented not only by the development of capitalism but by the lack of that development of capital. More capitalists with many resources are occupied with accumulation of capital in few hands for the great works that a nation must have. Defending and preserving uses and customs of old modes of production of native peoples can only lead to the worst of socialisms, primitive socialism. The following paragraph of Karl Marx is also hated by the Marxists of the world, an honor they do to him. One nation must and can learn from the others. Although a society has discovered the natural law that presides over its own movement, and the ultimate goal of this work is ultimately to bring to light the economic law that governs the movement of modern society, it cannot skip natural phases of development or abolish them by decree. But it can shorten and mitigate the pains of childbirth. 17. The quality of Marxists since 1912 throughout the world has been reduced to the quality of a Chinese commodity, cheap and of poor quality. The following phrase is also paramount, essential in the thought of Marxism: one nation must and can learn from the others. That which nations should nations learn? Of the barbaric, backward nations, or of the most civilized? Marxists have successfully sought to lead the social movements and workers' movements to follow the most backward nations in almost every aspect, namely economically, politically, socially, philosophically, technologically, scientifically. That is, they have followed the opposite path. You cannot skip phases of development, we have already seen this, but you can learn how the most successful nations have done. The other way, that of following backward nations, despots, has already been completely ruled out by the same story. Not once but more than a dozen times. The civilizational property of a society is in direct proportion to its ability to organize itself to build and produce goods and services. That is why capital, its object of study, is the commodity. In addition to that, the Communist Manifesto begins with the following sentences. In Capital itself he expresses that the wealth of societies in which the capitalist mode of production dominates is presented as a huge accumulation of commodities. 18. The key words of this sentence are wealth is synonymous with commodities. The greater the commodities, the greater the wealth of society. In other words, the more capitalism, the more wealth of society. These words are repeated throughout all his economic works. Social wealth is produced on a large scale, to an exponential degree in capitalism. That is what the work is about: how to create wealth, or how to found capitalism, improve it, and overcome it once the degree of maturity of the most advanced, most cultured country is reached. Returning to the Communist Manifesto, the low price of its commodities, of the bourgeoisie, is the heavy artillery with which it demolishes all the walls of China, with which it forces the most aristocratic barbarian tribes to capitulate in their hatred against the foreigner. 19. Obviously, if one wants to compete with a civilized country, what one must try is to create goods with equal or lower prices. To do this, it has to imitate or innovate or invent new forms of commodity production. We are here clarifying ideas, not to confuse or hide them as academic Marxists and so on have done. Let us remember that the Communist Manifesto was written mainly for Germany, in 1848, which was lagging behind at that time, with respect to England, and the tasks of the Communists was and should be to accelerate the development of capitalism in Germany, to produce commodities, to leave behind the feudal remains not only with the strength of the few workers and peasants and bourgeois, but also to urge the use of the state for that purpose. To subtract forces from German feudalism and strengthen capitalism. By doing the latter strengthens the worker in quantity and quality. Then it forces all nations to embrace the production regime of the bourgeoisie or perish. It forces them to implant in their own bosom the so-called civilization, that is, to become bourgeois. It creates a world made in his image and likeness. 21 of many comparisons between bourgeois society and civilization. England, with the invention of steam, placed itself at the head of modern bourgeois development. 21. The current world population, 7,960,224,535 is possible and is based on the invention of steam. The first industrial revolution made it possible to create commodities at low prices and therefore feed more people. In 1778 the world population was 682 million, in 250 years it multiplied by 11 times, thanks to the aberramiento of goods. The first industrial revolution was English and the consequent three practically two, they were produced in a former English colony, the United States, where English culture and language predominates. That is why we coined the term English mode of production, which is contained in Marx's works. This paragraph caught my attention given that when a nation is civilized, a good portion of the police and government are superfluous. And if already now civilization has taught men to seek their interest in the maintenance of public order, public society, and the public interest, thereby rendering the police, justice, and government superfluous in large part, how much more reason will this not happen in a society in which the community of interests will be elevated to a fundamental principle, in which the public interest will be confused with the individual interest. 21. When there is a good degree of civilization, the police, justice, and government are superfluous. The worker has to work surplus time to be able to materialize, to valorize, that is, to objectify the labor time necessary for its reproduction. On the other hand, and therefore also the necessary labor time of the capitalist is free time, time not required for immediate subsistence. As all free time is time for free development, the capitalist usurps the free time that the workers create for society, i.e. civilization, and Wade is right once again, in this sense, when he says that capital equals civilization. 23. There are too many words, let's explain why. For Karl Marx capitalism is equal to civilization, because the greater the development of the productive forces, the greater the education of the population to be able to produce, the greater the development, the more workers, the greater the development, the more automated society is obtained ready for socialism or communism that Karl Marx imagined. The introduction of machines and the division of labor, always the two problems together, stripping the labor of the worker of all individual character, have made him lose all attractiveness. But there is also, as an affirmation of the civilizing power of the Industrial Revolution, the subjugation of natural forces, machines, the application of chemistry to industry and agriculture, steam navigation, railways, electric telegraphs, the breaking of entire continents, the channeling of rivers, populations arising from the earth as if by charm. What previous century had you suspected that such productive forces slept within social work? 24. The subject of civilization, savagery, barbarism, and despotism have been studied by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels from their earliest writings to the end. These categories were used both to describe individuals, groups, peoples, or countries. The motto of civilization has never been addressed by any Marxist or left-wing character, because many Marxists do not belong to the world or civilized countries, therefore, they are opposites, enemies of civilized groups or countries. The need to ensure against accidental events and the necessary and progressive expansion of the process of reproduction, expansion that corresponds to the development of the needs and progress of the population, and that from the capitalist point of view is called accumulation, require a certain amount of surplus labor. It is one of the civilizing aspects of the capital that he starts the surplus work in a way and under conditions that are more favorable for the development of the productive forces, of social relations, and of the creation of the elements for a new higher formation, than under the previous forms of slavery, serfdom, etc. 25. Work is the key to development, of civilization, but only that of work combined or fused with science and technology, not rejecting it or seeking other extra-dimensional ways of development such as extensions of Setentero's hippies, either strengthening reactionary groups such as indigenous peoples and other nonsense. Steam gave us the capitalist society, the society of abundance, the society of civilization. The mill moved by arm gives us the society of the feudal lord, the steam mill, the society of the industrial capitalist. 26. Engels said in 1847, question 12, what were the subsequent consequences of the Industrial Revolution? Answer. Big industry created, with the steam engine and the other machines, the means to increase industrial production to infinity, in a short time and with little expense. In this easy regime of production, free competition, which is an obligatory corollary of big industry. 27. If capitalism is synonymous with civilization, the group that pushes that civilization, inventions, innovations, and so on is big industry and free competition, freedom of trade, freedom of industry. Things Marxists hate. By repudiating big industry they defend and support the petty bourgeoisie. The Marxists, by attacking the freedom of industry, today they called it neoliberalism, it is the same, they stop the free development of the productive forces. If you have read correctly, Marx and Engels defended, within capitalism, free trade, industrial freedom and big capital, big industry.